Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Tehami and these are the headlines. Prime Minister Imran Khan says durable peace in South Asia depends upon the resolution of all disputes between India and Pakistan, particularly Kashmir. He was replying to a letter written by his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi on Pakistan Day. Khan reiterated that Pakistan wants good relations with all its neighbors, but said creation of an enabling environment is imperative for a constructive dialogue. Pakistan says Afghanistan stands at a defining juncture as it has never been so close to turning the tide. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi was addressing the 9th Heart of Asia Istanbul Process Ministerial Conference in Dushanbe. He reiterated that there is no military solution to the conflict. Qureshi said Islamabad is extending all possible support to Kabul besides facilitating the peace process. In Afghanistan, 3 female polio workers have been shot dead in Jalalabad a day after authorities launched a new campaign against the disease. A spokesman for Nangarhar police said the women were killed in 2 separate attacks. No one has immediately claimed the responsibility for the attacks. The Saudi-led military coalition says it has destroyed 2 explosive-laden drones launched by the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Saudi state media quoted the coalition as saying one drone was intercepted over Yemeni airspace while the other was destroyed heading towards the kingdom. In Pakistan, the minister in charge of the pandemic control says the country will import China's CanSino coronavirus vaccines in bulk to package 3 million doses locally. In a tweet, Asad Umar said the first batch of 60,000 doses of the vaccine will arrive today amid a sharp rise in infections in the country. Meanwhile, UNICEF says the largest allocation of vaccine doses India supplied to COVAX never actually left the country. Globally, the virus has claimed nearly 2.8 million lives and has infected over 127 million people. Those are the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Prime Minister Imran Khan says durable peace in South Asia depends upon the resolution of all disputes between India and Pakistan, particularly Kashmir. He was replying to a letter written by his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi on Pakistan Day, saying his country wants cordial ties with Pakistan. The Prime Minister reiterated that Pakistan wants good relations with all its neighbors, but said creation of an enabling environment is imperative for a constructive dialogue. He also extended his best wishes to the Indian people in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says his country will continue to support a peaceful, sovereign and prosperous Afghanistan. He was addressing the 9th Ministerial Conference of the Heart of Asia Istanbul Process in Dushanbe. The minister told the gathering that the Afghan peace process stands at a defining juncture and it has never been so close to turn a new page.
Representatives from around 50 countries and organizations gathered in Dushanbe to discuss building a consensus around the peace process in Afghanistan. Addressing the meeting, Pakistan's foreign minister reiterated that there is no military solution to the protracted conflict in Afghanistan. Referring to the Doha peace deal, Qureshi said the pact is a historic opportunity to achieve an inclusive and comprehensive negotiated political settlement. But he cautioned against the role of peace spoilers within and outside Afghanistan. He said any space gained by ISIS and Al-Qaeda could worsen the crisis. On the sidelines of the conference, Qureshi held separate meetings with his Iranian and Afghan counterparts and Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. Qureshi highlighted the importance of peace and stability in Afghanistan for regional connectivity and development. First launched in 2011, the Heart of Asia Conference is part of Istanbul Process, a regional initiative on security and cooperation for a peaceful Afghanistan. This year's conference comes ahead of a key meeting on the Afghan peace process in Istanbul next month.
In Afghanistan, 3 female polio workers have been shot dead in Jalalabad a day after authorities launched a new campaign against the disease. A spokesperson for the Nangarhar police said the women were killed in 2 separate attacks. 3 security personnel were also killed in an attack elsewhere. No one has immediately claimed the responsibility. In recent months, the country has witnessed an uptick in attacks targeting Afghan officials, journalists and civil society activists. Earlier this month, ISIS claimed responsibility for killing 3 female media workers in Jalalabad. In Myanmar, the death toll from the military's crackdown on pro-democracy protests has crossed 500. This comes after security forces killed another 14 civilians on Monday. Activists across the country have launched a civil disobedience campaign to hurl garbage onto the streets. Myanmar's Advisory Council has labeled the military as a terrorist group that should face international court. In a joint statement, 3 armed ethnic groups called for the military to stop killing protesters and resolve political issues. They warned that they will join other ethnic groups from Myanmar's Spring Revolution to defend themselves. In another development, the UN Security Council will be meeting on Wednesday to discuss the situation in Myanmar. France has also decried the blind and deadly violence in Myanmar. The Saudi-led military coalition says it has destroyed 2 explosive-laden drones launched by the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Saudi state media quoted the coalition saying 1 drone was intercepted over Yemeni airspace while the other was destroyed heading towards the kingdom's Jizan region. The Houthi rebels have yet to comment on the incident. Last week, the coalition destroyed 2 explosive-laden boats and 2 drones launched by the rebels. The battle between coalition forces and the rebels rages on for the control of Yemen's Marib region. A real-world U.S. study shows that Pfizer and Moderna's COVID-19 vaccines reduce the risk of infection by 80% 2 weeks or more after the first of 2 shots. Globally, there are more than 2.79 million fatalities and over 127 million cases. More in this report.
To be the last wave of outbreak. Vaccine to people under the age of 55 and require a new analysis of the shot's benefits and risks. Meanwhile, the United States says its experts will review the WHO report on the virus origins to ensure that the investigation was independent and technically sound. While President Joe Biden announced 90% of adults in the U.S. will be eligible to get a vaccine by the 19th of April. He also urged the states to pause reopening efforts. Data shows that the country's cases have been spiking for the 2nd week in a row as top health officials warn of impending doom.
I'm going to reflect on the recurring feeling I have of impending doom. We have so much to look forward to, so much promise and potential of where we are, and so much reason for hope. But right now, I'm scared. I know what it's like as a physician to stand in that patient room, gowned, gloved, masked, shielded, and to be the last person to touch someone else's loved one because their loved one couldn't be there.
The World Health Organization and 23 states have backed the idea to create a treaty to help the world deal with future health emergencies. Meanwhile, Turkey has imposed tighter measures due to rising cases, and Austria's capital, Vienna, announced plans to extend an Easter lockdown. Over in the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson hopes the country will not need to go into another lockdown, but says he does not yet know how strong its defences against future waves will be.
What we don't know is exactly how strong our fortifications now are, how robust our defences are against another wave. And we've seen what's been happening. That's why I stress what's happening with our European friends, because historically, at least, there's been a time lag, and then we've had a wave ourselves.
Japan's health minister has apologized after his staffers violated COVID-19 protocols. Meanwhile, Australia's Queensland state has reported 8 new local cases a day after announcing a 3-day lockdown in Brisbane.
Pakistan has recorded a steep rise in COVID-19 mortalities in the past 24 hours. The health ministry reported 100 new deaths overnight, the highest number of the third wave. Pakistan has so far recorded 14,356 deaths since the pandemic began. More than 4,000 people tested positive for the 6th consecutive day. The virus has infected over 663,000 people countrywide, of which more than 600,000 have recovered. At the moment, there are nearly 49,000 active cases in the country, and the country's positivity rate has slipped to 8.82%. Meanwhile, Punjab Health Minister Yasmin Rashid says Pakistan will receive another 7 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine in April. Several countries have pledged millions of dollars to help save Syrian refugees from civil war amid the COVID-19 pandemic. The pledges were made during the 5th annual Donors Conference in Brussels, co-hosted by the EU and the UN, to seek $10 billion in aid. In a video message, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for addressing the rising needs of refugees. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced that Washington will give nearly $600 million to address the Syrian crisis. Qatar has pledged to give $100 million to help ease the humanitarian crisis, while the EU announced $656 million. Israeli forces have detained 10 Palestinians during raids across the occupied territories. The arrests come as Palestinians mark the 45th anniversary of the Land Day with anti-Israel protests. The day commemorates the sacrifice of those who fell while defending their lands in the 1976 war. People also visited the graves of the loved ones killed by the occupation forces. China has approved a sweeping overhaul of Hong Kong's electoral system. The reforms concern the method for selection of the chief executive, its legislative council, and the voting procedures. State media says the restructuring was endorsed unopposed by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. President Xi Jinping signed the orders to promulgate the amended annexes. The reforms authorize Hong Kong's Electoral Committee to pick 40 representatives of the city's legislature. Under the reforms, 20 representatives will be directly elected to the city's legislature. The size of the Electoral Committee will also be increased from 1,200 to 1,500. 2 French Navy ships have arrived at India's southern port city of Kochi to participate in a joint naval exercise. The ships will sail to the Bay of Bengal for the Quad members' 2-day drill, which begins on April the 5th. The Indian Navy accorded a ceremonial welcome to the French warships with assault helicopter carriers Twinner and Sarko frigate. The Quad members, including India, the US, Japan, and Australia, began their largest joint naval exercises in over a decade last year. The exercises are seen as a series of efforts to balance China's vast military and economic power in the region. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the U.S. does not seek to contain or keep China down, but aims to uphold the international rules-based system. Washington's top diplomat made the remarks at a virtual briefing to the foreign reporters. Blinken said the relationship between Washington and Beijing is not one-dimensional, but rather complicated. He said it is competitive, collaborative, and adversarial, all at the same time. Blinken reiterated the U.S. stance on the need to engage China from a position of strength. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In Rawalpindi, envoys from the EU, Denmark, Canada and China held separate meetings with the Pakistan Army Chief and appreciated the country's efforts for peace in the region, especially in Afghanistan. In a statement, the military's media wing said the Army Chief discussed matters of mutual interest and progress on the CPAC in his meeting with the Chinese envoy. It said the Army Chief thanked the envoy for China's contribution towards fight against the coronavirus pandemic in Pakistan. The Director General of Inter-Services Intelligence, Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid, also attended the meeting. In his meeting with the EU, Danish and Canadian envoys, the Army Chief said Pakistan looks forward to enhance multi-domain relations based on common interest. Bahrain says it admires China's efforts to maintain global security and peace. This comes after China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with Bahrain's King Hamad bin Isa bin Salman Al Khalifa in Manama. In a statement, Manama said the king affirmed Bahrain's pride in its close relations with China. Meanwhile, Wang appreciated the king's efforts to develop prosperous Bahraini-Chinese relations. Wang also met Bahrain's Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad and his counterpart, Dr. Abdul Latif bin Rashid Al Zaini. Bahrain's foreign ministry said the two countries have also signed a cultural agreement. Under the agreement, a Chinese cultural center will be established in Manama and a Bahraini one in Beijing. A UN investigation has revealed that a French airstrike in Mali on January the 3rd had killed 19 civilians. The UN mission in Mali said in a report that 3 armed men were also killed in the strike, but the French Defense Ministry has refuted the findings, saying the airstrikes targeted armed militants, not civilians. It said Ed Barkhan task force killed nearly 30 militants identified by aerial surveillance. Russia says it will respond to Australian sanctions on one of its citizens and 4 companies. The sanctions were imposed in response to Russia's construction of the Crimean Bridge. Australia sees the bridge as an attempt to consolidate Russia's control of the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula. Reacting, Russia's embassy in Canberra said Australia will bear the consequences. The US says it is committed to multilateralism and has a profound stake in engaging in the UN. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made these remarks in a virtual meeting with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Blinken said Washington aims to strengthen the founding principles and the values of the UN. He said no problems or challenges can be dealt by any country acting alone, even if it is the United States. The Secretary added the United Nations is where the countries come together to work on common challenges. Guterres said he welcomes new US initiatives to support multilateral responses to global challenges. The UN Secretary General urged Washington to play a leading role in drawing up a global vaccination plan to beat COVID-19. Guterres called for stepped-up diplomatic efforts for peace as famine is destroying lives in at least 6 countries. Israeli police have shot dead a 33-year-old Arab man with special needs. They accused him of attempting to stab a police officer in central Haifa city. Police say the victim was running around with a weapon when his mother called the cops to the scene for help. They say the officer felt that he was in immediate life-threatening danger, but the victim's family has denied the allegation and called the incident a cold-blooded murder. They say he did not have a knife and was running away from the cops. The family says the forensic report shows that the police shot 5 bullets, 3 of which hit the victim. In Mozambique, ISIS claims it has seized the control of the coastal town of Palma after days of fighting with the security forces. Mozambique's army said dozens of people were killed in a militant attack on Palma yesterday. In a statement, the militant group claimed to have killed at least 55 people, including a number of soldiers. The group said it destroyed and took control of buildings, including factories and banks, and seized vehicles. Aid workers say tens of thousands of people may have fled the town. The total number of dead or missing following the attack remains unclear. Meanwhile, the US has condemned the attack and vowed support for Mozambique in its fight against the terrorists. France has reopened its embassy in Libya after a 7-year closure in another sign of a gradual return of stability. French representatives have resumed operations behind a tall compound wall in a new building on the outskirts of Tripoli. Last week, President Emmanuel Macron announced the reopening after talks with the head of Libya's newly installed Presidential Council, Mohammed Al-Manfi. Paris closed its embassy after evacuating French and British nationals as fighting broke out in Tripoli in 2014. Macron called for all the foreign fighters' exit from Libya and said France and its European partners were united in backing the ceasefire. Libya's new unity government took office on 16th of March, completing a smooth transition of power after a decade of violent chaos. A Russian-invented game, RUGBALL, hopes to go mainstream after a sudden surge of public attention. The sport combines basketball, wrestling and rugby. More in this report.
If you are a fan of basketball, wrestling and rugby, but are indecisive on what to play, RUGBALL is the answer. As reported by the Russian Rugball Federation, this discipline received independent sports status on November 13th in 2003. However, its beginnings date back approximately 40 years, with the rules developed in the late 90s.
Back in the Soviet Union, wrestlers used to play so-called wrestling basketball as a part of the training process. As time passes, this wrestling basketball turned into a sport.
To an untrained eye, rugball may look disorderly, but there are strict limits to what players can do on the court. Many elements of wrestling are not allowed to reduce possible trauma risks.
Only wrestlers can endure it. Basketball players won't hold here. They have some dribbling tactics, but here, as you can see, it's all about wrestling and running. Main thing is to have a good functional condition. I'm 70 and I still run around with my boys.
The game is popular in Russia, where it is played at a professional level in a 22-team league.
In Venezuela, local mayors desperate for cash are levying hefty taxes and launching aggressive collection campaigns. This has prompted complaints from businesses struggling to stay afloat in an economy battered by the crisis and the pandemic. This report has more.
If the ongoing clashes between the military and armed groups were not enough, the locals now have to face another issue. Bills for local taxes and municipal services have jumped to thousands of dollars per month. It is the latest chapter in President Nicolas Maduro's abrupt liberalization of the economy as the US sanctions ushered in an end to generous subsidies.
With regard to cleaning fees, I think it is very expensive what they are charging apartments and premises. I'm a resident of Chacao and I also have a business here in Chacao. I think that cleaning fees are very expensive. I know that the service is good, but the cleaning service is excessively expensive. I would like them to have a restructuring of prices.
The tax issue has largely halted federal transfers of oil revenue to municipalities that had, for decades, kept local governments' covers full. It creates another challenge for businesses barely surviving hyperinflation and the country's sixth-year recession.
In addition to the problems of a dollarized economy, keeping a cleaning truck costs a lot of money. And then there's the simple fact of workers who are going through this economic situation, that they can move about. We know what the situation with public transport is like. With the metro, there's no cash. And for all cleaning vehicles to go out every day, and sometimes it is more than once a day, that street sweepers are out doing their job.
In some of the country's 335 municipalities, mayors are also authorizing concessionaries to increase rates for services. Earlier this year, Maduro said that mayors had to figure out how to finance municipal expenses. To add salt to Venezuelans' wounds, he insisted that they must pay for public services that were for years heavily subsidized.
It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. And other business updates, Pakistan's currency rupee has soared against the US dollar, dropping the foreign currency to 22-month low on the interbank market. In the second trading session of the week, the rupee appreciated by over 93 paisa against the US dollar. The dollar now stands equal to 153 rupees. The value of the dollar in the interbank market is at its lowest since June 2019. After touching 168 rupees in August last year, the dollar has so far depreciated by 15 rupees. The US stocks have declined after a jump in bond yields prompted investors to dump high-flying tech shares. The shares of Apple, Microsoft and Amazon have dropped between 1% to nearly 3%. This led Nasdaq Composite to trade by nearly 0.5% lower. The indices of S&P 500 and Dow Jones Industrial Average traded fractionally down. Meanwhile, the oil prices dropped as focus turned to an OPEC Plus meeting this week, with extension of supply curbs may be on the table. In the National Basketball Association, Washington Wizards beat Indiana Pacers 132 to 124 with Russell Westbrook's historic triple-double. It was the first ever triple-double in the league to include at least 35 points and 20 assists. He finished with 35 points, 21 assists and 14 rebounds, followed by Rui Hachimura's 26 points and 8 rebounds. Wizards won their second game in a row after losing 8 of their previous 9. Meanwhile, Miami Heat snapped a 6-game losing streak as they bested New York Knicks 98 to 88. Jimmy Butler scored 27 points for Miami, with Bam Adebayo adding 20 points and 17 rebounds. In other fixtures, the Los Angeles Clippers dominated Milwaukee Bucks 129 to 105, while Brooklyn Nets narrowly edged Minnesota Timberwolves 112 to 105. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus News.